Before we introduce our two next wonderful guests, I would like to have you take out your mobiles because we're going to do a poll. And the poll builds directly into the conversation we're about to have. By the way, good morning, I'm Kevin Martin, Head of Research at I4CP. I never, ever introduce myself, so. All right, so if you could bring out your mobiles and we'll bring up the poll, please. And what we're interested in knowing, so you can see the polling instructions right here, is we're interested in knowing if there is HR expertise on your current board of directors. Now, while you fill that in, what I'll let you know is a study that we just conducted in the fall with our partner, Extraordinary Women on Boards, which is an extraordinary organization of several hundred women who serve on close to 1,200 private and public company boards. What we asked them was, has your board brought in HR expertise in the last 3 years? 30% said yes, and 9% said they plan to do so in the next 12 months. So that's just a little bit of context. And you can see here, we've got, does your organization include a director? Yes, 30%. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, folks. It's incredibly consistent with what we've seen. And no, and D, I don't know. All right, well, you should get to know that if you don't know. But with that, what I'd like to do is introduce our two guests. And so, as I give them a brief introduction, they're gonna introduce themselves. Leah and Kristen, please come up on stage. Let's give them a round of applause, and I'll tell you a little bit about them in a moment. Kristen, good to see you. Okay. Leah, good to see you. Okay, thank you. All right, so I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. Now, just a little bit of background. Kristen Robinson is a chief HR officer at 4 different companies, including Pandora, Yahoo, most recently Splunk, and she serves on 2 mid-sized public company boards, Verint and Planet. And Kristen is also an advisor. I'm so thrilled about this. She joined I4CP as an advisor back in January, and you might be wondering, what does that mean? Well, she provides some really unique CHRO perspective and board director perspective to us. So we're working on for instance, CHRO transition kit, and Kristen gets to look at that and say, you're off the mark, or this is really good, stay with it, or fill this in. So we're so thrilled to have you, Kristen. Leah Sweet is a founding member of the Extraordinary Women on Boards, and she is not an HR executive. In fact, you were at PayPal in charge of digital and operations and all kinds of other things. It's too long to put into a title. And she is on the boards of GoDaddy, BMC Software, and Versapay, I remember, yes. And so Leah is from this area, correct, Arizona?
I live in Scottsdale.
Oh, how about that? And so thank you for hosting us. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna show you a little bit of the data that we collected. Now, what I'm about to share with you, if you look on the right-hand side of these 2 documents, the right-hand document is available to all of you on the app right now. And this comes from our latest research of 80 corporate directors that we collected in Q4 of last year. The document on the left-hand side, which is incredibly still relevant, was based upon data we collected with Extraordinary Women on Boards back in April of 2021. And we were really looking at the data considerations that board directors must be putting first and foremost. And so both of those are available to you. But what we wanted to do, and Leah and Kristen, please jump in here, because I know that this is this slide in particular has some interesting notes to it. One of the first questions that we asked of these board directors was, other than your company financials and other than strategy of the firm, what are the top issues that are on the agenda for your corporate boards? And industry-specific challenges came out top. Human capital came second at 54%. But look at the very bottom of the list. So culture, 10%. And when I first looked at that, Leah, and I just want to get your initial reaction. I look at that and I'm thinking, wow, huge disconnect between leading, lagging indicators or so. You had an observation on this slide.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here, and great to see everyone. So my perspective when I first saw the information on this is that the vast majority of the board members that you see out in the universe are not as enlightened as Satya, who we just heard about, and often don't necessarily understand the difference between company culture and human capital. And this is where I think over the course of this topic and discussion that you've been having the last few days is where it's incumbent on the HR leaders and HR organizations to help educate. Remember that most of the board members are former executives like myself who grew up in technology or grew up in a line of business or in sales. They are not HR professionals. And so thinking about things from the standpoint of culture versus human capital is a nuance that goes over many of their heads. And that's where you come into play.
Yeah, great observation.
Yeah, I mean,
Kristen.
I would say I was surprisingly, I was surprised that 54% was identified, as human capital, however you define that. Mm-hmm. I would say, based on my experience on 2 public company boards now, and supporting the boards of 5 public companies over the years, they're not allocating their time to focus on that or the other things too. And I think part of it is some of these things are intangible and they haven't yet seen how to account for these things. The topics of DEI oftentimes, culture, even other human capital topics are sort of amorphous, they're nebulous, they're intangible, seemingly unmeasurable. And it's our job, as Leah said, to help them see that, help them see how we can make those things more tangible.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about making the intangibles tangible in a little bit, because this is a topic that we think is so critical and yet very difficult. But before we do that, it'd be really great to get your perspective on, the role of the board. Educate the audience here, and what matters most to the board and why. And I know you both have thoughts on this. Kristen, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, I think most people would say, advisors would say the most important things for the board are to make sure the strategy is the right strategy of the company, to make sure you have the right leader, mostly the CEO, but more and more the broader executive team. And the third thing that I think is becoming more important is managing risk. And to the extent that in a talent-scarce world, human capital issues and some of these other leading indicators of company health are more important, I think they're starting to look at that more and more from a risk standpoint versus just kind of the general, people are important in the organization. It's risk.
That makes a ton of sense. We came out several years ago and said, talent risk is business risk.
Yes.
Talent advantage is business advantage. And the same can be said for culture, right? Culture risk is business risk, et cetera. Leah, what would you have to say about, what the audience should know about the role of the board?
Yeah, so in conjunction to what was just stated, keep in mind, the board is either elected or appointed by the owners of the company. Public company shareholders, private company, PE firms, or whoever may be the specific owners of the company. They're appointed by the owners of the company to make sure and oversee that the company is succeeding on whatever its mission and charter is. And oftentimes, that is interpreted, almost exclusively interpreted as being, are you hitting your financial goals? Are you hitting revenue, profits, returns, and shareholder price? But we all collectively know that in order to hit those goals, there are many detailed components that go within that. And it is the strategy, but it is also the talent, the people, how you work, and what kind of an environment you breed. And as you said, the risk associated with those being able to run effectively, morally, and legally. The board is responsible for overseeing all of that, but oftentimes narrows their focus to the financials and to the strategy. And part of that is certainly the fault of the boards for not pushing those agendas further. Part of that is the fault of the management team of narrowing and not pushing those topics. But irregardless of whose fault it is, the responsibility lies in the board and the leadership team to bring all of those topics to bear. We all know that when times are good, you spend a lot more time talking about the fuzzy stuff that goes along with HR. But when times are bad, you have a tendency to focus in on what are the financials, are we hitting our numbers, what are the sales, and so on. It cannot be just when times are good that you talk about the people. The company cannot exist without the people. So HR needs to be able to bring this to the board, to the leadership team, and educate them about what's happening within the organization. Even if they push back. I've had many a CEO who has pushed back on even wanting to have HR come and talk at the board meetings. It is incumbent that you as HR leaders push and that you have direct ties with the board so that you can make sure to bring the important topics to the table about how the company works.
You know, Leah, what you just mentioned reminds me of something that, a question that we posed to the audience on Tuesday. And the question was, one of the more important questions that any of these executives should be always asking, any executive, is what must be true? What must be true for our strategy to succeed? And inevitably, your people, your culture, the health of those things, the skilling of those critical assets or intangibles, whatever you want to refer to them, that elevates it, or that always brings that, or that would bring that back to the forefront, right? If you're talking about strategy, don't bring in HR. Well, really, what must be true? You know? So just out of curiosity, before we go into some of the more data that was captured in the study, if you could look back, if you could reverse back to when you were executives and having a chance to have your first presentation to the board, knowing now from your experience being board members, what is it you wish you would have known going into that first experience that you could share with everyone? And Leah, let's start with you.
Yeah, very simply, transparency is good. So many times, especially when you're not the CEO, when you're a member of the staff, you want to put your best foot forward in front of the board. You want to present the good data. You want to kind of tone down and soften the issues so that it looks like you're doing a really good job. Well, you can be doing a really good job and still have issues. Boards are there to help you. They are there to make the company succeed and help the company succeed. The only way you can do that is with transparency. And so I wish I would have understood that when I was younger, that I didn't come in with just the hurrahs, that I also came in with these are the watch items that we have on the table, so that I could use their expertise and their guidance to be able to help resolve those issues.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Kristen.
I agree with that. And transparency not only is important for them to have a whole sort of truer picture of what's going on in the organization, it can give you more credibility too. Because if you have a handle on what's not working so well and you have some ideas about how you're going to address that, then that shows how you're thinking about it. My big thing learning over years, and I said before, I supported 5 public company boards from inside the company over the course of, I think, 17 years or so, and now being on a public board. I wish I hadn't assumed that board members knew more than me. You know, really, board members don't know your business as well as you do. You're there every day, 24/7 oftentimes. They come in every quarter, and they're there to impart sort of their wisdom, their ability to connect dots from the external marketplace and the world based on their experience, but you know more than they do. And especially in the field of human resources, you know more than they do in this field, especially since over the last few years, we've gotten so much better as a profession of doing research, like I4CP, like having data. And so if we can help to educate them with our knowledge, because we do know more than they do as specialists in this profession, it's really gonna add a lot of value to the board, to them individually, and help them understand how important these other topics are that we're talking about. So, be confident that you can add something, that you can educate, that you can help them understand, because most of the time they're not coming from our discipline and really haven't thought as deeply about these topics as you all have.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So true. I'm the chairman of the NomGov committee for GoDaddy, and we recently just added 2 new board members. So we went through an exhaustive process of interviewing quite a few candidates for those board positions, and it was interesting. The vast majority of the people that I interviewed, and these are people who have amazing careers, founders, CEOs, they've been on many different boards, been on many different companies. They all had one common thing that they said on why they would want to join the board is because they want to join a board where they can learn something. Not just that they bring something to the table, but that they grow as well. So even those people that are so well renowned are constantly hungry to learn more. And to your point, very few of them come having much knowledge about the HR side of the business.
Leah, just out of curiosity, the answer is yes on the boards Kristen serves on because you're the HR expertise.
Well, I would just say about that, they know that they ought to have human capital expertise, but I wouldn't say that they know what they really need. So I, together with the CHRO, feel like I can educate my board colleagues as well.
Yep.
But at least they took the first step and looked for someone with the profile from a human resources background.
Yep. And Leah, do the boards that you serve on, do they have anyone with human capital expertise beyond being a line leader who managed?
No, they do not. And this is interesting because I've had this conversation with various CEOs and senior leaders within the board about what skills are the most important skills to bring onto the board. And repeatedly, the human capital skill is prioritized far lower than technology, strategy, financial skills, CFO skills, even CLO, Chief Legal Officer skills. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the way our companies have worked in the past, and it was just talked about in the previous talk, is considerably different than how things are today. But most of the people that are in boards are from how things were, not how things are. So they don't necessarily see the importance of that HR skill set. Again, this is where the chief legal officer, the chief HR officer and chief legal officer, but the chief HR officer is so critical in having a voice at the table with the board and educating the board members about the culture, about the people, about the processes, and about the data of what's happening within their organization and why it matters.
Well, Leah, you know what? It's like you were feeling it from the audience, because there's several in the audience here who are chief people or HR officers who were the former chief legal officer. And then they transferred over. So they get you. They're like sitting there going, go, sister. I get you. All right. So if we could bring up the slides again, I just want to show a couple data points because we're going to transition into making tangible the intangibles. And great. Thank you. And so just a couple of things we wanted to show you. So Kevin Oakes showed earlier when asked of these board directors what issues, and we only excluded financial condition of the company as an answer selection here. So we said, other than financial condition of the firm, what are the top issues deserving of more board attention in the coming year? And you could see that company strategy came out on top, human capital 40%, but what company culture showed was only 16%. And I believe DEI was at 9%, and ESG was at 16%. And so there's some of the other areas there, just to put it into to context or fuller context. But the good news is that 80% of the boards, when we asked them, the HR function in general, not the CHRO, but the HR function in general, over the next 1 to 3 years, do you believe it will become more important on the boards that you serve, or the companies that you govern, stay the same or less? And 80% said more. And I would just like to get both of your perspective on that. Why do you think they answered that way when there is such a disconnect? Or maybe it's the human capital piece that they talked about, and I'm looking more at the intangibles, but what's your reaction to that?
I think it's because there's a recognition that the world is changing and has changed.
Yeah.
You see it in the attrition data, you see it in the employee survey results, you see it on Twitter and on Reddit and on every social media channel that you can identify. It is something that there is a recognition that things are different, and there's many senior leaders and many boards that are saying we need help to be able to figure out how to deal with this. And HR is the obvious place to get that help from.
Yep, right. And so these are a couple of the key findings. Now, these aren't necessarily in the words of I4CP. So we wrote this up with the co-founder, Lisa Shallett, of Extraordinary Women on Boards. Lisa's on a couple of boards herself, former Goldman Sachs executive, non-HR executive. But we all agreed when we looked at the data that one of the key findings from the research we did is that the boards must emphasize the key intangibles more. Another one is that as boards' attention on strategy continues to heighten, it's always been high, but continues to heighten, emphasis on culture health is a must. And we talked about earlier our own research on culture fitness with what Catherine Brecken will be sharing with you later this morning we know that it's so highly correlated to long-term financial success of a firm. And so here's the one that I want to dive into, because I think this is really, really important for this audience. But what the data shows is that the data that the boards are getting, most boards receive around human capital, it tells a very incomplete story. Here's what we mean by it. So one of the questions we asked in the survey, and we listed out over 20 different variables, and we said, which of these data does your full board, not just the comp committee, but the full board have access to? And you could see that listing there. But then we juxtaposed that with, we did ask, what data don't you have access to that you wouldn't find value in? We said, hey, of the data you don't have access to, would you find value in the following? And they could have either chose no value or high value. And these are the ones they chose high value in. And so we can now take this off, unless you want to leave the data slide up here, but I really want to get into the intangible conversation with you. Can we ditch the data slide?
Sure.
All right, good, because we'd rather look at you guys instead. All right, hide the slides, please. All right, thank you. So let's talk about the intangibles. And when you think about the intangibles, what accounts, so Leah, let's go back to what you were talking about. What do you think accounts for this disconnect that we're seeing here between, for instance, the criticality of culture and the ability to execute strategy? Other than perhaps the conflation of human capital and culture, but they need to look at it separately. But just get your thoughts on that.
We hit on it a few different times, and you saw it in that slide that we just had there, which is there's a lot of data that the board does not get access to, and in many cases has never had access to. within the previous organizations that they had responsibility for. I mean, think about it. How much has the evolution of capturing data about the health of our culture changed in just the last 5 to 10 years? It's been a significant metamorphosis in exploding the amount of data we have access to through the technology, through social media, through our willingness to actually collect the data. So I think for many of the boards, they're behind the curve. They're behind the curve in understanding the importance and even understanding what data to look for. And so they're not necessarily making that full linkage. I think they know it anecdotally. And you hear a lot of anecdotal comments, a lot of questions, but it still relies very heavily on what are the messages you're getting from the senior leadership team and what are the lagging indicators you're getting from attrition and hiring data. But data, if they had more access, I think would make a significant difference in board members being interested and willing and see the importance of it.
Okay. So more data in that
Absolutely.
regard, right? And Kristen?
What I would say is, yes, more data and more of a story around what that data is telling you. And what's really interesting is a couple years ago, I was actually thinking about a company to go to as the chief HR officer. So I was doing my due diligence and looking at some of their disclosures, government disclosures, and they were a UK-based company. And for those of you who know kind of the environment in Europe, they are required to disclose and publish so much more about their human capital strategies and the state of their organization. I mean, literally, this human capital disclosure for this UK company was probably close to 30, 40, 50 pages. And I actually think that we're going there. In fact, more shareholder groups are looking for a way to formally account for human capital, run costs versus human capital investment, so they can see how much companies are actually investing, but they're trying to do that from an accounting standpoint. A British group, instead of saying, how do we make the intangibles tangible, they said, how do we make the uncountable countable?
Okay.
And again, from a kind of an accounting standpoint.
Yeah.
But, I think back, because culture is this thing that everyone thinks you can't really measure. It's like if you're a fish, it's the water you swim in. You don't really know, you appreciate, it's the air that we breathe. But we can put data together with it and strategy with it. I'll tell you a couple things that I have done in my last company as the chief people officer. I brought in a leading firm to help us diagnose the culture. And based on employee feedback, we surveyed 50% of the employee population. And what that did for us is it helped us understand our cultural style, it put data behind it, and it gave us a nomenclature, to talk about and describe and understand our culture. So that was really helpful. The second thing I did, which was really interesting because it helped me shape my thinking on this, is I took a page from the Culture Revolution. Renovations,
Yep.
Thanks. Culture Renovation book that Kevin Oakes wrote a few years back, and I created a culture dashboard. So I had to think about, what are the indicators? It's not going to be one data point. I mean, think about your financial health of a company. If boards only saw one data point, that would tell you nothing. So what could be a curated list of topics and data points that I could gather over time that would help me articulate the health of our culture? And so I did things like, of course, attrition, but not just general attrition of people in their first year of hire. If we're trying to hire new people with different skill set, is the organization rejecting them? Or are we actually not doing a good job hiring for the new skills that we need? I looked at Glassdoor ratings. I looked at our pipeline to see how people were interpreting our talent brand out in the marketplace. So not just the internal things, but external things. So I compiled this, list of probably 10 to 15 types of metrics that gave me, my team, the company, the board, kind of a more holistic way to measure our culture.
Yeah, the context matters
Yes.
a ton, right?
Yes.
Like an attrition data point on its own, what the heck does that mean? But it's where, it's why, it's what's happening, right? And does that link to culture and other things? You know, Leah, we were talking beforehand, I was referencing how there was a discussion that I was a part of earlier this week with a lot of chief HR officers around how do you prep the board going into a board meeting with the context of what you're showing to them and why it matters and what you need from them. And it was referenced in great detail by Michael Horn from Dow yesterday, who I thought was talking so wonderfully about, you know, how he would prepare the board, the context. And we were talking about an executive summary. And I'm curious, on the boards that you serve, do you have experience from an HR executive who prepares the board with like an executive summary prior to a board meeting that provides the context needed here?
It's a great question, and one of the things that I've seen is when it's the business line executive, when it's the chief financial officer, even the chief legal officer, you get narratives ahead of time. You get slide decks as well, but you get narratives, written Word document narratives ahead of time that give you context as to this is what the data means. I have never once gotten that from an HR professional. I've gotten reams of charts of data, but not a narrative. And I think it's not for the lack of that HR person probably not wanting to put one forward, it's just not thought about. And so it would be phenomenal if we were, as members of the board, able to get the perspective of the chief HR leader and the HR team on what are the aspects that we and they are considering. Right now, it relies very heavily on the CEO to share that. And the CEO is going to have a different perspective than the chief HR person. And so it's important for that transparency to be there with the HR team and the board as much as it is with the CEO and the board.
Yeah, and I would say I never did that. You know, as we were talking about, it's like, darn, I should have done that. But, you know, one way that you can get to the board, if your CEO kind of isn't supportive of kind of you doing that kind of informing of the board, is your comp committee. Oftentimes comp committee nows, you know, they're called talent and compensation committees. Some are called culture committees. You've got to deal with executive comp, but more and more, that's an avenue that you can talk about the broader human capital issues and things like culture. So I've done executive summaries for the comp committee, not the full board, but, you know, for all of you who don't feel like, don't wait for an invitation, you know, always invite yourself. But if you're finding it hard to like open up that avenue to the board in that form, try it out in your comp committee, because oftentimes it's an easier first step. And your comp committee too can be helpful in getting those topics, you know, talked about at the board.
Absolutely. Comp committee is a great step to come in. And another thing too that's happening a lot now is, especially if you're on a public company board, public companies, their shareholders, their shareholder groups are pushing much more to have visibility into what is going on from the DE&I, obviously from ESG, from trying to get a better understanding what's happening with the culture and the human capital of the company. So your investor relations person, even within your company, probably is hearing a lot of this from the investor groups themselves and having to field those questions themselves. And so this sometimes can just stay within that realm, but the board wants to know that the shareholder groups are concerned about this, and they want to hear from more than just the IR person. They want to hear from the folks that are actually driving the organization, what is happening within the organization, because it's their responsibility as much as it is the executive team's responsibility.
Thank you for that. So So we only have 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure if anyone has any questions, please go to the mic. And so if, because what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to sit here and go, well, let's take questions, and then it's chirp, right? That's so awkward. We're not going to do that. So if you have questions, come forth to the mics that are around the room, okay? And I see someone coming through, so let's take a question right now. I see right over here. Oh, I see people over there and there. Okay, let's start with the lady in the blue over here.
Hi.
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 Good, how are you? So I guess most people know the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I have a meeting with my board, and that's kind of my theme. I just want my data to kind of tell a story, and I just wanted to know what kind of advice you have on how I can apply my metrics to kind of persuading them to give me what I want. That makes sense.
So I would say first, don't try to massage the metrics to give the story you want. That's like science 101. You have to let the data tell the data story. But what you do want to do is the data, there's always a story behind the data. So when I'm looking at a chart, especially, let's take an example of something that was in the slides about employee movement, okay? I could see an employee movement chart, and I would have no idea if a high percentage was good or bad. Absolutely no idea as a board member, because I don't know how you as a company function internally, whether or not you encourage employee movement or whether you don't encourage employee movement. So what I would look for in your messaging is for you to be able to explain to me, okay, employee movement is high, but that's because we're trying to create a culture of having fast-forming teams as we're moving into an agile development process, and this is what we wanted to see. So this is a good thing. You need to provide that context on why the data is what it is, and help just tell the story so that we can understand what we're seeing.
Yeah, and I would start with what's relevant for your company here and now. We can put up all the numbers that are generic, attrition rates, hiring rates, head count, all that stuff. But what are the issues that your company is dealing right now from the business standpoint? And then what are the people, culture, org issues that have a connection to that? And so can focus on that, because that's going to be more relevant than just a whole bunch of generic metrics.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say also the best organizations that we see out there is they understand clearly what the leading indicators of culture health are, and that's agreed to by the executive team, and so everyone's aligned with what they are, and you just simply can show the data that either shows progress or not and what you're doing about with that. Yes, over here.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Caitlin Townsend-Lamb with Cascade Engineering. And so my question is, for those, I'm sure there's many of us in the room in this situation. So I'm just starting to join both nonprofit and financial institution boards. So as that person that's coming into a board outside of your company with this perspective, what are some recommendations or piece of advice you have for educating your fellow board members on what they need to consider? How would you go about that?
Well, maybe you can start since you are on board.
Yeah, and it's interesting. What I'm learning about being on a board is it does take time. It does take time to get to know your board colleagues. You come together infrequently, once a quarter. And so there's a good portion of time where you're just trying to figure out who's who, what they care about, and how you can add differentiated value. I think that you can do that actually in partnership with the CHRO, and I'm doing some coaching kind of around the side to help the CHROs know what's could be really interesting for the board and most important, so that they can come to the table. And then a lot of it initially, I think, is asking the questions in the first place, because no one else is asking those questions. And then you ask the questions, you have a break, go have a side conversation, with different board members. So I think there's more of an informal way to educate and help people start thinking about these topics.
I totally agree with that. Board dynamics are such that you need to recognize you're not going to be giving presentations to the board as a board member. The way that you communicate a point of view or the way that you are able to bring forward issues is through working with the management team, asking the questions, being able to connect the dots in the meetings, prior to the meetings, through possibly even special sessions that get held. But it does take time. Don't get discouraged if you are dismissed or if you are not necessarily, your points aren't as understood right away by the other board members. It's not that they don't see the importance, it's just that the linkages haven't been made yet. So keep at it. Keep asking the questions, keep pushing for the data, and work with the executive team to make sure that it's brought forward.
Thank you.
Great. I see 2 people standing up. We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask that let's get these questions out here quickly, and we'll make our answers brief. So I'll start way in the back first, and
good morning, my name's Linda Calvin, I'm with Reboot Representation, and I like that you say the data tells the story. So women of color only represent 4.6% of board positions. And so in thinking about how there's the disconnect between DEI and culture with boards, then can you speak to that? Do we have such a deficit that that's the reason why it's not on their minds? And if you had more diversity on the board and we flipped that script of 4.6, couldn't we address some of those issues that we're seeing now where they're non-issues, but they really are? Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
So let me give you a specific example. This has to do with women in technology versus your specific example, but it makes the same point. When being on a board and looking at metrics of percentage of women in leadership positions, especially in technology groups within the company, I'm often the only person in the room who's asking, why are the numbers not moving? What's happening? Who are the names? What kind of pay are they getting? How does this work? It is just not top of mind because it's not part of their world. So would it make a difference to have more representation in the boardroom? You're darn right it would. Yes.
And more shareholders and shareholder groups like ISS are watching this very closely. They're tallying up the numbers of, do you have people of color on your board? Do you have women on your board? And companies are getting dinged. And one of my boards has gotten dinged, and I'm telling you that because it's public, but we are doing a much more diligent job of looking at how we constitute the board in a more diverse way. So it kind of took us to get dinged by it and bad on us, but it actually is forcing companies to move the needle.
It does, it does. You now see ISS Glass Lewis will give you a no on your say on pay vote if you don't hit certain thresholds on diversity. And that's only getting more and more stringent as time goes on. And while there are always going to be people that complain about that type of oversight, I think it's a fantastic thing because it forces the needle to move.
I just learned we have another 4 minutes, which is great.
Okay.
And that's why I was looking at you and I'm like, thank you for your patience. But yes, you've got a question?
Great, thank you. I really appreciated the lens you've put on the role that the company through the executives provide information back to the board. But I'm curious on how the information goes back the other way. So sometimes it feels like there's a one-way mirror. The company prepares for board meetings, and then often the information, the discussions, the questions, the concerns don't make it back down. Do you think that's by design, by default? Should that be altered? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. I think that's very much the culture of the leadership team in place. I've seen every variation of that. I've seen extremely open communication between the CEO and their executive team and the board and the executive team. I've seen it where you can't contact the senior leadership team. You can only get report outs from them in specific meetings, and it was tightly controlled. A lot of that is dictated by the chair and the CEO and the approach that they take. What I'd recommend is if you're in a situation where there's not as much engagement, you can really try to push your CEO and chair through a more positive mechanism and say, have we thought about having mentors for our senior leaders with individual board members to start to, not necessarily to create the relationships, but for them to be able to give some guidance and direction to you as a senior leader. That creates a relationship which allows for more communication to be going back and forth. That's a kind of behind the scenes way to do it as a senior leader. As a board member, as a board member, I think it's absolutely incumbent on board members to really make and push the CEO to allow them to have engagement with the leaders within their organization, because you don't know what data is getting filtered, like you're saying.
Yeah, the other thing tactically inside the organization, I always encouraged my CEOs, like right after the board meeting, maybe the next day, maybe on the Monday afterwards, to bring our senior leaders together and say, here's what we covered at the board meeting, here were some of the concerns. Oftentimes, you know, it's uneventful, so there's not like breaking news from the board meeting, but sometimes there is. I always, as the CHRO, would get together right after board meetings with my team and say, okay, here's what we talked about. Here are things that we have to think about for the next board meeting and how we can share more information or address certain certain issues. And so inside the company, you can suggest that, you know, there's, dare I say, a cascade after Gary yesterday say that's a bad word, but how you can get that information flowing to the right people in the organization.
So in just the waning moments that we've got here, I want to see first off, we're all good? Okay, excellent. So parting shots. Take it any direction you want to go, because we've covered a lot in the 40 minutes that we've had your incredibly valuable time. But whether it's advice, you've given a lot of advice to the head of HR and how they're working with the board and can do so even better. There's a lot of people in the audience here who are going to be soon presenting up to the board. And I'm wondering if you have advice for them on what they can do now to best prepare for that, or for the CHROs in the room, what can they do to best prepare their teams for their first engagement with the board, or any other advice you might have? Kristen, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say don't wait for them to tell you what they want to see, because they don't know. You know. So set your own agenda, figure out a way to educate simply, succinctly, in bits and pieces over time, and try, as we've talked about, making those intangibles tangible. And I would say, even if you're not at the place where you're going to be up next to talk to the board, you can be thinking in your function and seeing things that you can go to your chief people officer to say, you know what, I'm thinking the board might be interested in this kind of topic. So keep your eyes and ears open and keep those ideas flowing to your leader.
Great.
Fantastic, and agree with what you said, and with that, keep in mind that you know more than they do. Think about it from the standpoint, if you were on the board, what would you want to know? What do you think is important for someone who is responsible for the company success, which you are as well? What is important to know? Be confident in your perspective. You earned your place at the table to get to where you are, and you know more than they do. So bring it.
I love it. Bring it, right? And so I want to just confirm something real quick. I'm getting screwed up by the time monitor. We're all good. All right, good. I'm getting we're all good now. Leah Sweet, Kristen Robinson, you are wonderful. You're extraordinary. And thank you so much for your time, your perspective, and giving back to this community here. We appreciate you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.